Ma'am, the janitorial staff uses the service entrance. This checkpoint is for operational personnel only. The words, slick with a practiced and casual condescension, slid from Captain Davies' mouth and hung in the sterile, chilled air of the security nexus. He didn't look up from the data pad he was pretending to study, an affectation of importance he had long since perfected. It was a power play, a small act of theater designed to diminish, to put the person standing before his polished chrome counter firmly in their place. The half-dozen junior guard arrayed behind him, young men and women barely out of their teens, shifted their weight. A few exchanged nervous glances, while two of the younger men snickered quietly, the sound sharp and unwelcome in the echoing hall. They were taking their cues from their superior, learning the subtle cruelties of institutional authority. The woman on the other side of the counter offered no reaction. She simply stood there, a portrait of unnerving stillness. She was so profoundly unremarkable that her presence felt like a deliberate act of camouflage. She wore a simple, charcoal gray pantsuit, the kind of anonymous attire favored by mid-level administrators or traveling auditors. Her shoes were flat and practical. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, functional bun, and her face was devoid of makeup, a clean slate upon which no emotion was written. She carried a worn leather satchel, its surface cracked and faded not from neglect, but from decades of constant, careful use. She didn't fidget. She didn't sigh. She didn't clear her throat or demand to see a supervisor. She just waited, her silence a dense, heavy object in the room, absorbing the captain's arrogance and the guard's nervous energy without reflecting any of it back. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over Davies' head, patient and unwavering. High above, in the command observation deck that overlooked the entire entrance complex, General Marcus Thorne stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the scene unfold on the main monitor. He had been about to turn away, lost in the endless paperwork that was the burden of his rank, when the woman had first approached the checkpoint. Something had caught his eye. It wasn't her appearance, which was intentionally forgettable, but her stance. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible distribution of her weight, perfectly centered, ready to move in any direction with explosive efficiency. It was a warrior's stance, a predator's calm, masked beneath a librarian's exterior. It was a stance he hadn't seen in 20 years, not since a sand-choked night in a forgotten corner of the world where a ghost code-named Echo had held a collapsing flank with nothing but a rifle and an impossible calm. He leaned closer to the armored glass, a forgotten memory stirring in the depths of his mind. He saw the worn satchel she carried and noted the way her right hand never strayed more than a few inches from it, a study in practiced weapon retention. He saw the faint, pale scar that traced the line of her left temple, mostly hidden by her hair. He saw the quiet competence radiating from her, a signal that only those who had seen true professionalism in the face of chaos could recognize. Down below, Captain Davies, blind to these subtleties, decided to escalate. He finally looked up, his eyes sweeping over her with theatrical disdain. "Look," he said, his voice dripping with false patience. "I don't have time for this. Whatever sales pitch you've got, we're not interested. Turn around and use the civilian entrance like everyone else." The woman's expression did not change, but she blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, she spoke, and her voice was as plain and unadorned as her appearance. "My appointment is with General Thorne. He is expecting me." The statement was flat, devoid of pleading or anger. It was a simple declaration of fact. Davies let out a short, barking laugh. "The general? Right. And I've got a meeting with the president. Ma'am, I'm the head of security for this entire quadrant. Every person who comes through this gate is on my schedule. Your name is not on it. So, for the last time," but General Thorne was already turning from the window, a cold knot of anger and dawning realization tightening in his stomach. He knew that voice. He knew that impossible stillness. He started for the door of his office, his long strides purposeful. He knew he was about to witness either a masterclass in humility or an execution of institutional pride. If you believe respect is earned in silence, not demanded with noise, type "earned" below. The confrontation stretched, each second thickening the atmosphere of misplaced authority and silent defiance. Captain Davies, buoyed by the perceived validation of his subordinates' nervous compliance, seemed to grow larger behind his desk. He was a man who defined his worth by the rigidity of the rules he enforced, especially upon those he deemed beneath him. This woman, with her quiet refusal to be intimidated or dismissed, represented a malfunction in his carefully calibrated world of hierarchies. He saw her not as a person, but as an anomaly to be corrected, a nail to be hammered down. He leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the counter, a posture meant to intimidate, to loom. "Let me be crystal clear," he began, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial growl that was intended to be menacing but only sounded theatrical. "This is North Star Command. This isn't a corporate office park. This is the nerve center for global strategic defense. We have protocols. We have procedures. People don't just have appointments with a commanding general. It doesn't work that way." The woman, Alara Vance, remained a statue of placid observation. She tracked his movements with her eyes, but her head didn't move. It was the kind of focused attention one gives to a complex but predictable piece of machinery. The silence that followed his pronouncement was her only reply, and it infuriated him more than any argument could have. He felt the need to fill it, to conquer it with the sound of his own voice. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing on the old leather satchel. "Regulations state all baggage must be submitted for screening." He gestured to a large, intimidating X-ray machine to his right. He expected a protest, a flicker of fear, some sign that he had finally found a chink in her armor. Instead, she complied without a word. Her movements were fluid and economical as she lifted the heavy-seeming bag and placed it gently on the conveyor belt. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. It was the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this exact sequence of actions thousands of times. The junior guards watched, their earlier amusement fading into a kind of morbid curiosity. They had never seen their captain so fixated on a single individual, especially one who presented such a negligible threat. There was a palpable tension now, a sense that this was no longer about procedure, but about a personal battle of wills. Davies strode over to the monitor of the X-ray machine, eager for the revelation that would vindicate his suspicion. He expected to find he wasn't sure what. Contraband? A poorly concealed recording device? Something, anything, that would prove his judgment correct. The bag slid through the scanner, and its contents appeared on the screen in ghostly shades of green and blue. Davies stared. The other guards crowded behind him, peering at the monitor. The bag contained a single laptop computer, nestled in a protective case. Next to it was a thick, leather-bound journal and 3 pens. There was a power cable, a small, sealed bottle of water, and a simple aluminum keycard with no markings. But an especially padded compartment at the bottom, isolated from everything else, was a dense metallic object. It was a solid, custom-milled block of what looked like tungsten carbide, with a single, perfectly machined slot on its top surface. It was inert, featureless, and utterly baffling. It resembled no weapon or device they had ever seen. "What is that?" one of the younger guards whispered. Davies scowled, his confusion mounting. "What is this object?" he demanded, turning back to the woman. She had already retrieved her bag from the other side of the scanner and was holding it patiently. "It's an on-block clip," she said, her voice still a monotone. A diagnostic tool, the technical jargon, delivered so plainly, only served to further irritate Davies. He felt his control slipping. He was the authority here. He was supposed to be the one with the answers. This woman, with her quiet calm and inexplicable hardware, was making him look foolish in front of his own team. He decided to pivot back to his strongest position, bureaucratic power. "I don't care what it is," he snapped. "You have no clearance. You have no authorization. You are a security risk. I'm going to have to ask you to accompany me to a detention area until we can verify your identity." He reached for the intercom button to summon an escort team, a final, definitive act to end this humiliating encounter. And it was in that exact moment that the world ended. A klaxon, shrill and terrifyingly loud, shattered the sterile quiet of the checkpoint. A synthesized voice, devoid of emotion, began to chant a single, horrifying phrase from speakers embedded in the ceiling. "Red Alpha, Red Alpha, Red Alpha." Containment protocol engaged. This is not a drill simultaneously. Every light in the expansive hall extinguished. replaced by the hellish, pulsing glow of crimson emergency strobes. The world became a frantic heartbeat of red light and screaming alarm. Heavy blast doors, previously hidden within the walls, began to descend with a deep, groaning sound of immense hydraulic pressure, sealing off the checkpoint from the rest of the base. The junior guards panicked. One fumbled for his sidearm, his face a pale mask of fear in the rhythmic flashes of red. Another spun around, his eyes wide, looking for an exit that was rapidly disappearing. Captain Davies himself was thrown into chaos. He lunged for his command console, his fingers flying across the keypad, trying to access the override controls. "Command, this is Checkpoint Alpha. What's the status? What's happening?" He yelled into his comms unit, his voice tight with rising panic. The only response was a burst of static, followed by the same chilling, automated voice, "Red Alpha. All external communication is severed. All access is locked. Remain at your station," Davies swore, slamming his fist on the console. "Override. Override command 79er Delta." The screen in front of him flashed a single, mocking message in block letters. "Access denied. System in hard lockdown." He was trapped. The head of security was locked out of his own system, a prisoner in his own fortress. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and fear. The young guard were looking to him for guidance, for reassurance, but all they saw was their leader's authority crumbling in real time. He tried another code, then another, his movements becoming increasingly frantic and sloppy. In the midst of this escalating chaos, Alara Vance was an island of absolute serenity. The blaring noise, the flashing lights, the palpable terror of the men around her, none of it seemed to register. She hadn't flinched when the alarm first sounded. She hadn't gasped. She simply stood, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant piece of music. As Davies' desperation reached its peak, she set her leather satchel down on the floor with deliberate care. She knelt, unzipped a side compartment, and her hands moved with the unhurried, precise grace of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicked. She was methodical. Her every action was imbued with a sense of purpose that stood in stark, jarring contrast to the frantic, useless energy of the guards. Davies, in a moment of sheer frustration, saw her out of the corner of his eye. "What are you doing?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get away from that bag. This is a base-wide emergency." She ignored him completely. Her focus was absolute. She withdrew the strange, heavy tungsten block he had seen on the X-ray scanner. It felt impossibly dense in her hand. She rose to her feet, her movements still measured and calm, and began to walk towards the central command pillar in the middle of the room. This pillar housed the master biometric interface, the one terminal that had ultimate physical control over every lock, door, and access point on the entire installation. It was the heart of the base's security, and right now, it was as dead and unresponsive as the rest of the system. "What do you think you're doing? Get back here," Davies bellowed, taking a step towards her. "That's classified equipment. You touch that, and I'll—" He stopped, his threat dying in his throat. He saw the look in her eyes for the first time. It was not the blank, passive gaze of an administrator. It was the cold, calculating focus of a master craftsman sizing up a broken machine. It was an expression of such profound competence and absolute control that it momentarily stunned him into silence. She was no longer just a woman in a gray pantsuit. She was something else entirely. She reached the master biometric scanner, a sleek, dark panel glowing with a menacing red light that pulsed in time with a base-wide alert. The screen above it read, "Network integrity compromised. Paladin protocol required." This was the system's last line of defense, a digital fortress designed by its creators to be utterly impenetrable from the outside during a catastrophic failure. It was meant to isolate the core of the command center, even from its own security chief, to prevent a compromised user from causing further damage. It was working perfectly, too perfectly. For Davies and his men, it was a tomb. For Alara Vance, it was just another lock waiting for the right key. She didn't look for a card slot or a keypad. She ignored the frantic, useless interface entirely. With her left hand, she placed the heavy tungsten block onto a small, recessed ledge just below the scanner. It clicked into place with the satisfying, precise sound of perfectly machined parts meeting. The on-block clip, she had called it, a diagnostic tool. The block immediately began to emit a low, resonant hum, and a series of small, blue lights flickered to life along its edge, synchronizing with the base's power cycle. It was a physical key, a piece of hardware that spoke to the system on a level far more fundamental than software. Davies and his guards could only stare, their mouths agape, a mixture of fear and utter confusion on their faces. They were witnessing something that defied their training, something that wasn't in any of their manuals. Then, she performed the final, impossible action. She raised her right hand, her fingers straight and held together, and placed it flat against the dark glass of the biometric scanner. Her touch was light, yet deliberate. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The red light continued its rhythmic, ominous pulse. The klaxon continued its deafening scream. Davies let out a choked, incredulous scoff, a final gasp of his shattered authority. See? It's useless. Nothing can. He was cut off by a sound. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the din of the alarm with absolute clarity. It was a high-pitched harmonic chime, a pure, clean tone that signaled a successful interface. Then another, and another. A rapid cascade of chimes, like a digital waterfall, echoed through the hall. On the main screen, the terrifying red warning vanished. It was replaced by a single line of crisp, green text, biometric signature verified. Welcome, Director. A split second later, the klaxon cut out. The sudden, deafening silence that rushed in to fill the void was more shocking than the noise had been. The hellish red strobes extinguished, replaced by the steady, calm glow of the standard operational lighting. And then came the sound that sealed the moment in legend. From every corner of the massive complex, from the deepest sub-basement to the highest communication tower, came a single, thunderous sound. Clack. It was the sound of 1,000 magnetic locks, 100 blast doors, and every single security seal on the installation disengaging at the exact same instant. It was the sound of the entire fortress surrendering its authority to a single touch. The lockdown was over. The system was hers. The green lights on every sealed door in the checkpoint flashed on, and the massive blast doors began to retract smoothly back into the walls. The air, which had been thick with tension, suddenly felt light again. The guards were frozen in place, statues of disbelief. They stared at their consoles, which now displayed a calm, green, all-clear status. They stared at the open doorways. But mostly, they stared at the woman. The quiet, unassuming woman in the gray pantsuit, who now stood with her hand still resting on the scanner, the architect of this impossible miracle. Captain Davies' face was a ruin. The arrogance, the condescension, the sneering superiority, it had all been sandblasted away, leaving behind the raw, pale foundation of pure shock. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide and unblinking. He whispered the words to himself, a mantra of disbelief. No way. That's not possible. That's impossible. The heavy blast door to the main corridor finished its ascent with a soft hiss of hydraulics, revealing the tall, imposing figure of General Marcus Thorne. He hadn't been running. His uniform was immaculate. His stride was measured and calm, but his eyes were blazing with an intensity that made the young guards flinch and instinctively straighten their postures. He moved with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of a force of nature, his polished boots clicking a steady, authoritative rhythm on the polished concrete floor. He completely ignored the cluster of stunned security personnel. His gaze was fixed, locked onto the unassuming woman standing at the central pillar. He didn't spare a single glance for Captain Davies, who seemed to physically shrink as the general approached, his face paling even further. Thorne walked directly to Alara Vance, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of her, the regulation distance for addressing a superior officer, though she wore no rank. He looked at the main console screen, which still glowed with the words, Paladin Protocol engaged. Manual override. Successful. Welcome, Director. A slow, thin smile touched the corners of the general's lips, a rare expression that was equal parts relief and profound respect. He then looked at the woman, his eyes tracing the faint scar on her temple, and all the pieces of a 20-year-old memory clicked firmly into place. The ghost of the desert, the operator who could make machines sing and enemies fall silent. Echo. In emotion so crisp and precise it seemed to cut the air, General Thorne snapped to the most rigid and formal position of attention. He raised his hand in a salute, his arm a perfect 90-degree angle, his fingers pressed tightly together. It was not the casual salute one gives colleague. It was the deep, reverent salute a soldier gives to a legend or a king. Director Vance, he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that resonated with absolute authority. My sincerest apologies for my subordinates. Lack of professional courtesy. He was not briefed on the nature of your visit. The word director landed in the silent room like a physical blow. The junior guards stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the title with the woman before them. Captain Davies flinched as if he had been struck. Thorne held his salute for a long moment before slowly lowering his hand. He then turned, his body moving with the stiff precision of a parade ground drill, to face the now terrified security team. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, found Captain Davies. Captain, he began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You and I will be having a very long conversation about your future, or lack thereof, in my command. But first, an educational moment seems to be in order for your entire team. He swept his gaze over the young, bewildered faces of the guards. For those of you who believe rank is only worn on a uniform, for those of you whose judgment is clouded by the arrogance of a title and a shiny badge, allow me to illuminate you. He gestured with a sharp, definitive nod towards the woman who was now calmly detaching her en-bloc clip from the console. This is Director Alara Vance, and you, Captain, are standing in her house. General Thorne's voice filled the cavernous space, each word delivered with the weight and precision of an artillery strike. He wasn't shouting, but his quiet intensity commanded more attention than any screamed order ever could. The guards stood frozen, like statues in a museum of their own failure. You see this facility? Thorne asked, making a slow, deliberate sweep with his arm. The miles of fiber optic cable beneath your feet? The quantum encryption servers humming behind these walls? The very biometric scanner you so arrogantly guarded? Director Vance is its chief architect. She designed it. She wrote the foundational code. She stress-tested every firewall, every circuit, every line of its defense. The system you operate every day is not just a tool she uses. It is a living extension of her will. He took a step closer to Davies, whose face had taken on the waxy, bloodless pallor of a man staring into his own professional grave. The Red Alpha alert, Thorne continued, his voice laced with ice. That was not a system failure. That was a diagnostic she initiated remotely the moment your terminal illegally attempted to block her access. It was a test of the system's integrity, and a test of the character of the men and women charged with guarding it. The system passed. You, Captain, failed. Spectacularly. He paused, letting the crushing weight of that revelation settle over the room. The guards exchanged horrified glances. Their panic, their fear, the chaos of the last 10 minutes. It had all been an elaborate self-inflicted wound, a trap sprung by their own captain's prejudice. Thorne turned his attention back to the wider group. The Paladin Protocol is her creation, a failsafe within the failsafe. It's a ghost key that responds to one and only one biometric signature on this planet. Hers. It exists for the sole purpose of allowing the system's creator to reclaim control from an operator who is compromised, incompetent, or in your case, Captain, simply too blinded by his own ego to do his job. Thorne's gaze once again fell upon Vance, who was now placing the tungsten block back in her satchel with the same unhurried calm she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal. The respect in the general's eyes was profound, bordering on reverence. Before she became the civilian director of the entire Joint Command's cyber defense infrastructure, he said, his voice softening slightly. Before she built fortresses of code and light, she had another life. She was field call sign Echo for 12 years. She was the senior intelligence operator and network specialist for Task Force Nomad. The things she has done, the places she has been, they are so far above your security clearance that if I were to speak them aloud in this room, I would be legally obligated to have you all detained under the National Security Act. He let that sink in. The name Task Force Nomad was the stuff of hushed legend, a unit so classified that its very existence was officially denied. She holds 3 Distinguished Service Crosses for actions you will never read about. She wears the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded in a ceremony that never happened for a mission that officially never existed. She is not just an administrator. She is a national asset. And you, Captain, he said, his voice becoming a venomous whisper as he turned back to Davies. You tried to send her to the janitor's entrance. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of careers ending, of worldviews shattering, and of a new and powerful legend being born in the sterile, unforgiving light of Checkpoint Alpha. The name Alara Vance was no longer just a name. It was a lesson branded into the memory of every person who stood witness. The story of what happened at Checkpoint Alpha spread through North Star Command not like wildfire, but like a change in atmospheric pressure. It wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It was whispered in secure comms channels, shared in knowing glances across crowded mess halls, and typed into the footnotes of after-action reports. It became known by various names: Davies' Folly, the Director's Handshake, or simply the Paladin Incident. It morphed from a simple event into a piece of institutional folklore, a modern parable for a new generation of soldiers and operators. New recruits assigned to security details were taken to the central pillar at Checkpoint Alpha, and a grizzled master sergeant would point to the biometric scanner. You see this panel? He'd say. This is where the most important lesson you will ever learn at this facility was taught. It's the place where a captain with 20 years of service learned that arrogance is a heavier burden than a full field pack, and competence doesn't always wear a uniform. The tail became a powerful tool, a shorthand for the eternal lesson of humility. An officer getting too loud and demanding would be quietly told to remember Captain Davies. A technician dismissing the input of a lower-ranking specialist would be asked if they checked the system for echoes lately. The legend served as a vital corrective to the institutional pride that could so easily curdle into prejudice. As for Captain Davies, he was not discharged. General Thorne, in an act of what some called cruel mercy, decided that a simple termination would be too easy an escape. Davies needed to learn, not just be punished. He was stripped of his command and his rank, busted down to a simple guardsman. Then he was reassigned. His new post was Gate 14, the desolate, windswept service entrance on the far side of the base, the very entrance he had so contemptuously suggested for Director Vance. For 12 hours a day, he stood in a small, isolated guard shack, checking the IDs of delivery drivers, sanitation workers, and, yes, the janitorial staff. His first few weeks were a private hell of humiliation. But slowly, inevitably, the lesson began to take root in the barren soil of his broken pride. 6 months after the incident, a young female airman, fresh from basic training, was assigned to his gate. She was nervous, eager to please, and accidentally spilled a full cup of coffee across the console. An older logistics sergeant, waiting to be processed, began to berate her mercilessly, calling her incompetent, clumsy, a waste of a uniform. The Davies of old would have joined in, eager to assert his place in the pecking order. But the new Davies, the humbled guardsman, stepped out of his shack. "That's enough, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It was an accident. The airman is new. Give her a break." The sergeant, surprised, started to argue, but stopped when he saw the look in Davies' eyes. It was a look of profound, weary understanding. Davies then turned to the mortified airman and handed her a rag. "Don't worry about him," he said gently. "We all make mistakes. Let's get this cleaned up. I'll show you a shortcut in the diagnostic to reset the board." He had, in his own small way, become a guardian not just of the gate, but of the very principle he had so spectacularly violated. Alara Vance, the catalyst for all this change, remained largely oblivious to the legend she had created. The incident at the checkpoint was, to her, a minor and predictable logistical snag, an irritating but ultimately trivial variable in a complex equation. She had dealt with far worse, with far more at stake. A captain's ego was a small fire to extinguish compared to the nation-state cyber attacks she dismantled on a weekly basis. After overriding the lockdown, she had proceeded to her meeting with General Thorne. For 3 hours, they sat in his office, speaking in the quiet, technical shorthand of 2 seasoned professionals. They discussed sensor network upgrades, vulnerabilities in satellite uplinks, and the persistent threat of quantum decryption. She spoke with the same dispassionate precision she had used at the gate, her focus absolute, her knowledge encyclopedic. She was not there to be celebrated. She was there to work. Her job was to protect the nation's secrets, to ensure the silent, digital walls that guarded them were perfect and impenetrable. The personalities of the men and women who stood on those walls were a secondary concern, relevant only when their flaws compromised the integrity of the system itself. The day after her inspection was complete, as she was preparing to depart, a young guard approached her near the transport hub. It was one of the men who had snickered at Davy's initial insult. He was pale and visibly trembling, his hat clutched in his hands. "Mom, Director Vance, ma'am," he stammered. I just wanted to apologize for my conduct at the checkpoint. It was unprofessional. There's no excuse, ma'am. I'm sorry." Ilera looked at him, her gaze analytical rather than judgmental. She saw not the boy who had laughed, but a component of the security apparatus, a human sensor that had been improperly calibrated. She gave a single, small nod of acknowledgement. "Your apology is noted," she said, her tone neutral. Then, she added, "Your posture at the console yesterday. You're leaning on your left elbow. It shifts your center of balance and slows your draw time by 1/4 of a second. Standcentrate. Efficiency of motion is the foundation of security." The young guard stared at her, stunned. He had expected a reprimand, a dismissal, or perhaps a lecture. He had not expected a technical correction, a piece of practical, professional advice delivered without a trace of anger or condescension. It was a simple offering of competence, a quiet act of mentorship that was far more impactful than any punishment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a newfound awe. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded again and turned to board her transport, her worn leather satchel in hand. She left behind not just a corrected security posture, but a lesson that the young guard would carry with him for the rest of his career, that true professionals care about the work, not the ego. They correct flaws not to punish, but to improve the system as a whole. The biometric scanner at Checkpoint Alpha, meanwhile, had become something of a holy relic. The guards kept it polished to a mirror shine. It was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol. It was a physical reminder of the day the system's ghost had materialized to remind them all that the most important credentials are the ones that are carried not in a wallet, but in the quiet, undeniable force of one's actions. It was forever known as the Director's Hand, a monument to a quiet professional who had remade their world without ever raising her voice. A year passed. The seasons changed at North Star Command, but the story of Director Vance endured, solidifying from anecdote into doctrine. It was now a mandatory part of the curriculum at the base's Security Forces Training Academy. In a state-of-the-art lecture hall, General Thorne stood at a podium, addressing the newest graduating class of security officers. They were young, proud, their uniforms stiff and new, their faces alight with the earnest, untested confidence of youth. Behind the general, projected onto a massive screen, was a single, grainy image. It was a security camera still from that fateful day. A plain-looking woman in a gray pantsuit, her hand resting calmly on a glowing scanner, her face a mask of serene focus amidst a backdrop of flashing red lights and panicked motion. The photo had become iconic, a piece of institutional art. General Thorne let the image hang in the air for a moment, drawing the eyes of every cadet in the room. "Look at this picture," he commanded, his voice filling the auditorium. "Don't look at the chaos. Don't look at the emergency lights. Look at her. Memorize her. Not her face, not her clothes. Memorize her calm. Memorize her focus." He began to pace slowly in front of the stage, his gaze sweeping over the young faces before him. "We are going to teach you how to handle every weapon in our arsenal. We will teach you tactics, procedures, and the rules of engagement. You will learn protocols for every conceivable threat, from conventional assault to information warfare. But the single most important lesson you will ever learn is not in any of our field manuals. It is in that photograph." He stopped and pointed at the screen. That woman, Director Ilera Vance, never fired a shot. She never raised her voice. She never once cited her rank or her title. And yet, with a single, quiet action, she took command of this entire base from a man who had more stripes on his sleeve than she had words in her vocabulary that day. She did it because her authority was not granted by a commission or a title. It was forged in decades of silent, relentless, undeniable competence. The room was utterly silent, the cadets mesmerized. Your greatest enemy, Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, will not be an intruder at the gate. It will not be a saboteur in the wires. Your greatest enemy is the arrogance that lives in your own heart. It is the prejudice that allows you to judge a person by the cut of their clothes, or the color of their skin, or their gender. It is the lazy, convenient poison of assumption. You'll be tempted every day to take shortcuts, to believe you know everything, to dismiss those you deem unimportant. I am telling you now, that path leads to failure. It leads to the kind of blinding ignorance that almost brought this command to its knees. He walked back to the podium, his expression grim but filled with a teacher's passion. Competence has no uniform. Valor has no designated gender. And respect, he said, leaning into the microphone, his voice resonating with profound conviction. Respect is the sacred currency of professionals. It is not given. It is not demanded. It is earned. It is earned in the quiet hours of study. It is earned in the disciplined repetition of your duties. It is earned when you choose to listen instead of speak. It is earned when your actions are so clear, so precise, and so effective that they require no explanation. He looked up at the picture one last time, a flicker of deep admiration in his old eyes. Learn this lesson now. Burn it into your souls. The quietest person in the room is often the one you should be listening to the most. Strive to be the person whose work speaks for itself, so you never have to. The legacy of that single moment became woven into the very fabric of North Star Command's culture. The story of Alara Vance was no longer just a cautionary tale about a failed captain. It had transformed into an inspirational saga, a foundational myth for a new standard of professionalism. It was a reminder that true strength was not about projecting power, but about possessing it so completely that you had no need to display it. Her quiet competence had become the new ideal, a benchmark against which all personnel, from the lowest-ranking airmen to the highest-level commanders, were implicitly measured. The ripples of her actions spread beyond the base. General Thorne, energized by the incident, spearheaded a new command-wide initiative focused on competence over credentials. It was a program designed to identify and elevate individuals whose skills and performance far outstripped their formal rank or position, creating pathways for unconventional talents to rise. He used the story of Director Vance as his prime example in briefings at the Pentagon, arguing that the next great threat might be defeated not by the person with the most stars on their collar, but by a quiet genius hidden in plain sight. The final, most enduring part of her legacy was perhaps the most subtle. The young guard she had corrected, the one who had apologized to her, took her advice to heart. He practiced his stance. He focused on efficiency of motion. He rose through the ranks, his quiet professionalism earning him the respect of his peers and superiors. Years later, as the new head of training for the Security Forces Academy, he stood on the same stage as General Thorne had, and behind him, the grainy photo of Director Vance was still projected on the screen. He told the story not as a legend he had heard, but as a witness, his voice carrying the weight of personal transformation. He taught his cadets that respect was a verb, an action, a conscious choice to see the potential for excellence in everyone, regardless of their appearance. Alara Vance herself would never know the full extent of the change she had wrought. She was a builder, a problem solver. She had identified a flaw in the human component of her system and, in her own efficient way, had corrected it. She had moved on to the next problem, the next firewall, the next threat lurking in the silent world of data and code. Her legacy wasn't something she left behind in a blaze of glory. It was something that continued to move forward in the improved actions of countless others. It was in the humble guard at a remote gate, treating a janitor with dignity. It was in the young officer who listened respectfully to the advice of an experienced enlisted sergeant. It was in the quiet confidence of a new generation taught to value what a person can do over who they appear to be. True strength, the story of Alara Vance taught them all, is not the shout that demands attention, but the silence of a job done so perfectly that it changes the world, even if just a little, and requires no applause. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance and where silent action defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.